The signal light at Sears Crossing glows a solitary, blood red in the pre-dawn gloom. It is 3:03 a.m. on August 8, 1963. The signal is dead, a lump of unlit metal. But the light is not broken. It has been gloved. A leather glove, pulled over the bulb by an unseen hand, casting the stretch of track into a deliberate, deceptive darkness. The only sounds are the rustle of a late summer wind through the Buckinghamshire hedgerows and the frantic, rhythmic thumping of a man's heart. He is crouched in the signal box, a prisoner, watching his own fate and that of the night mail unfold. The wires have been cut. The telephones are dead. He smells the oil from the signal mechanisms and the cold sweat of his own fear. Then, a distant vibration. A low hum that grows into a rhythmic, earth-trembling clatter. The upmail train from Glasgow, the postal special, is right on time, a silver bullet in the night. Its driver, Jack Mills, sees the red light a mile out. He eases back on the throttle, the brakes hissing in protest. The 12-carriage train, heavy with sacks of registered mail, slows to a crawl. As it passes the signal box, Mills peers into the blackness, seeing nothing but the distorted reflection of his own locomotive in the glass. He has no idea that just ahead, the tracks are being watched by 15 pairs of eyes. A crude, homemade signal has been placed on the line. A leather strap, weighted with a heavy bolt, draped over the contact wire. It glows a fake, sickly green. Confused, Mills brings the powerful diesel engine, D326, to a full stop. His fireman, David Whitby, climbs down from the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel. He expects a broken track, a fallen tree. What he finds is a spectre. A man emerges from the shadows, his face a grotesque mask under a bowler hat, a stocking pulled tight over his features. He is holding a weapon. Whitby freezes. Before he can cry out, he is seized, a hand clamped over his mouth, and dragged roughly towards the back of the train. The world has just shifted on its axis. This is not a delay. This is a heist. The driver's door is wrenched open. Jack Mills is confronted by another masked man, this one brandishing an axe handle. "Get out of the cab, or I'll kill you," a voice snarls. Mills, a veteran of the rails, is tough. He grapples with the intruder, reaching for the fire iron. It's a brave, futile gesture. The cosh comes down, once, twice, cracking against his skull. Pain explodes behind his eyes. He slumps, dazed and bleeding, as he and Whitby are forced to uncouple the front two carriages, the engine and the high-value packages coach, from the rest of the train. The robbers are surgical, precise. They know the layout. They know the procedures. The HVP coach is the prize. Inside, 72 post office workers sort through a fortune. Not just banknotes, but used, untraceable banknotes. Millions of them, being sent back to London for destruction. The men inside hear the train stop, feel the jolt of the uncoupling. They assume it's a routine shunting operation. They have no window to the nightmare outside. The door of their coach is suddenly flung open. A masked figure stands silhouetted against the night. He doesn't say a word. He simply raises a fist, and the air is filled with the sound of running feet. The gang swarms the carriage. They are a silent, efficient wave of violence. They are not there to negotiate. Coshes and crowbars rise and fall. The postal workers are herded to one end of the carriage, forced to lie on the floor, their hands on their heads. The smell of fear is thick now, a metallic tang in the air, mixed with the scent of old paper, ink, and sweat. The only sounds are the ragged breathing of the terrified men, the thud of sacks being thrown to the floor, and the calm, chillingly polite instructions of the gang's leader. "Lie still, lads. Be good, and no one gets hurt." The voice is educated, almost gentle. It is more terrifying than any shout. For the next 40 minutes, the HVP coach becomes a scene of organized chaos. The gang works with a frenzied rhythm, passing 120 heavy mail sacks down a human chain to a waiting army truck, its engine purring softly nearby. They are not ruffians. They are a well-drilled team. They have done their homework. They know they have a timetable. The next train, the Down Express, is due on the parallel track. They have precisely 15 minutes to finish the job before the entire plan is blown wide open. As the last sack is tossed into the truck, the leader gives a low whistle. The gang melts back into the darkness from which it came. The army truck, loaded with what they believe is over £2.5 million, a sum so vast it is almost abstract, rumbles down a country lane and vanishes. The entire operation, from the stopping of the train to the disappearance, has taken less than 45 minutes. They leave behind a scene of surreal stillness, a bleeding driver, a terrified crew, a plundered mail coach, and the lingering scent of engine oil, crushed grass, and crime. The most audacious robbery in British history is over. And for the criminals, the real trouble is just about to begin. The silence they left behind was profound, broken only by Jack Mill's groans and the frantic, fumbling efforts of David Whitby to get help. The red light at Sears Crossing still glowed, a false accusation against the night sky. It took precious minutes for the men in the rear carriages to realize something was catastrophically wrong, longer still to find a working telephone. When the police finally arrived, they were met with a scene of almost theatrical criminal perfection. The clues were scant, deliberately so. A few discarded mailbags, a set of military-style webbing, the homemade signal, a crude thing of leather and wire that spoke of meticulous planning, not brute force, and the smell, lingering traces of engine exhaust, trampled earth, and the faint, coppery scent of blood from the gash on Jack Mill's head. The investigation began not with a bang, but with a slow, dawning horror at the scale of the deception. This was not a smash and grab. It was a military operation. The robbers had known the train schedule, its composition, its vulnerabilities. They had used the landscape itself as a weapon, choosing a remote, sweeping bend where the driver would have no choice but to obey a false signal. They had isolated the one coach that mattered with chilling efficiency. Detective Superintendent Jack Slipper of Scotland Yard, a man with a face like a clenched fist, took one look at the scene and knew this was different. This was the work of professionals. The Great Train Robbery was not just a crime. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of the entire British establishment. The backstory of this audacious act was not written in a day. It was woven in the back rooms of London pubs and in the garages of safe houses across the home counties. The mastermind was widely believed to be Bruce Reynolds, a charismatic and sophisticated thief who moved in the shadowy world of London's high-end criminal fraternity. He was no common thug. He appreciated fine art and jazz. And he saw the postal system not as a public service, but as a flaw in the system, a river of cash flowing predictably through the English countryside every night. The target was not a random choice. It was intelligence, gathered over months, perhaps from a corrupt insider. The up special on certain nights carried used banknotes, a fact known to only a handful of people. The plan required capital, organization, and, most of all, silence. Reynolds assembled a crew of 15 men. It was a mixture of old-school heavyweights like Gordon Goody men with a reputation for violence and specialists, a train driver to advise on the mechanics, a corrupt solicitor to launder the money, and a landowner to provide a remote hideout. The farmhouse at Leatherslade, in Buckinghamshire, was rented under a false name. It was here, amidst the smell of hay and dust, that the final plans were laid. Maps were spread across kitchen tables. Toy trains were used to rehearse the uncoupling. Every eventuality was considered. The gloves for the signal lights, the army truck for the getaway, the fake number plates. It was a symphony of criminal logistics. The men were not just colleagues. They were a platoon, bound by the promise of wealth and a shared, unspoken understanding of the consequences of failure. For 2 weeks, they waited at Leatherslade, the tension of physical presence in the cramped farmhouse. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and anticipation. They played cards, they drank tea, they stared out at the quiet fields, each man wrestling with his own private fears. The night of the robbery, they moved like ghosts. They blackened their faces. They checked and rechecked their equipment. The drive to the ambush point was made in near total silence, the headlights of their vehicles off, guided by a moonlit knowledge of the back roads. When the train was stopped and the money was loaded, the mood was not jubilant, but focused, tense. The real test was the escape. The army truck was abandoned and set ablaze in a nearby wood, the flames licking at the evidence. They transferred the loot to other cars and returned to Leatherslade, not as triumphant bandits, but as fugitives, the weight of their crimes settling upon them like a shroud. Back at the farm, the atmosphere changed. The initial adrenaline gave way to a grim, methodical process. The 120 mail sacks were hauled into the main living room. The sheer volume was overwhelming. They ripped them open, and the floor disappeared under a sea of used banknotes. The smell was distinctive, the musty, slightly sour odor of countless hands, of old wallets and tills. They stacked the notes into piles, their fingers growing numb. The count was slower than anticipated. The promised £2.6 million was, in reality, closer to £2.3 million. A fortune, but less than the legend. 4 days, they lived in this bizarre camp, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, yet trapped, unable to leave, listening for the sound of every passing car, every distant dog bark, their paranoia growing with each hour. They had pulled off the perfect crime. Now, they just had to get away with it. The farmhouse at Leatherslade became a gilded cage. The initial euphoria of the heist had evaporated, replaced by a cloying, creeping dread. The air, once thick with planning and ambition, was now stale with the smell of unwashed men, cheap tobacco, and that peculiar, musty odor of millions of used banknotes. They slept in shifts, one eye always open, ears straining for the sound of a police siren or the crunch of tires on the gravel lane. Their fortune was stacked around them in tea chests and sacks, a fortress of paper that offered no protection. Every creak of the old house was a potential raid. Every distant voice carried on the wind was a detective. They were kings of a domain they dared not leave, prisoners of their own success. The plan had been to lie low for a week, maybe 2, before dispersing like smoke. But the plan was crumbling. The sheer logistical nightmare of dividing the loot was immense. Counting it was one thing. Laundering it and spending it without raising suspicion was another. Arguments flared in the tense, confined space. Disagreements over the split, over who had done what, over the very future they had stolen for themselves. The camaraderie of the platoon was fracturing, replaced by the individual suspicions of 15 men who now saw each other not as comrades, but as potential liabilities. The leader, Bruce Reynolds, maintained a calm exterior, but the pressure was an anvil on his chest. The perfect crime was proving to be a messy, human affair. Meanwhile, the net was closing. The police investigation, led by the tenacious Tommy Butler of the flying squad, was a methodical machine. The burnt-out army truck was found, a treasure trove of forensic evidence for 1963. Inside, detectives found a Monopoly set, a child's toy, a bizarre, domestic detail in the heart of a violent crime. It was a clue that humanized the robbers, but it also narrowed the search. Then came the break. A local farmer, his curiosity piqued by the comings and goings at the supposedly empty Leatherslade farm, peered through a window. He saw nothing of the men or the money, but he saw something else: fresh groceries, empty tins, the signs of recent habitation. He called the police. When the first officers arrived, they found the farmhouse abandoned. But it was not clean. The robbers, in their panicked, hasty flight, had left behind a bonanza of evidence. The place was a museum of the crime. Fingerprints were everywhere, on whiskey glasses, on food tins, on the Monopoly board itself. They found the stockings used as masks, the weapons, and, most damning of all, a military-issue webbing belt that was traced directly to one of the gang. The robbers had vanished, but they had left their identities behind. The manhunt was now a race, and Scotland Yard had a list of names. The first arrests came quickly. Some of the gang were caught through sheer bad luck or arrogance. Others were betrayed by their own desire to return to their old lives, to their families. The money, for many, became a curse. They couldn't bank it. They couldn't spend it in large amounts. They buried it in gardens, hid it in attics, stuffed it under floorboards. But the weight of the notes was nothing compared to the psychological burden. They were marked men, looking over their shoulders in every pub, jumping at every knock on the door. The dream of a life in the sun was replaced by the grim reality of life on the run, a cold, lonely existence funded by stolen cash they dared not use. The trial, when it finally began at Aylesbury Crown Court, was a national spectacle. The public's fascination with the gentleman bandits had curdled into something darker after the violence of the robbery. The image of the cosh and the axe handle overshadowed the audacity of the plan. The judge, Mr. Justice Edmund Davies, set the tone. He was determined to make an example of them. The sentences he handed down were unprecedented for a crime where no one had been killed. 30 years each for most of the men. The number echoed through the courtroom, a life sentence for many of them. It was a message from the establishment. This kind of challenge to the state would be met with the full, crushing force of the law. The great train robbers were no longer folk heroes. They were convicts, destined to grow old behind bars. The clang of the prison gates at HMP Winchester, HMP Parkhurst, and other high-security institutions was a brutal, final sound. The 30-year sentences were a seismic shock, not just to the men in the dock, but to the entire country. It was a punishment meant to crush, to serve as a permanent deterrent. The public, once titillated by the robbers' audacity, now saw them as violent thugs who had coshed a working man. Jack Mills, the train driver, never fully recovered from his head injury. He suffered from debilitating headaches and a deep-seated trauma, a ghost of the rails who died just a few years later, his death forever linked to that night. The human cost of the crime of the century was no longer an abstraction. It was a broken man and his family. Inside, the robbers became legends in their own right, but it was a grim, confined legend. The prison system did not know what to do with them. They were treated as a special category of criminal, subjected to stricter controls and longer periods in solitary confinement. Yet, within those cold, stone walls, their notoriety gave them a strange power. They were the aristocracy of the underworld, respected and feared by other inmates. But this was no compensation for the loss of freedom. The days bled into one another, a monotonous stretch of time measured in lost Christmases, missed birthdays, and the slow, inexorable aging of their bodies. The millions of pounds they had stolen were as distant and useless as moon rocks. But the story was far from over. The most dramatic chapters were yet to be written, born from the sheer, indomitable will to be free. Escape became an obsession. The first to make a serious attempt was Charlie Wilson, known as the Silent Man for his role in the robbery. He was transferred to Winson Green Prison in Birmingham, a place considered a fortress. But on a foggy August morning in 1964, just a year after the robbery, 3 men used a ladder and a rope to scale the prison wall. They smashed Wilson's cell window, pulled him out, and vanished into the mist. The operation was as clean and professional as the train robbery itself. It was a stunning embarrassment to the authorities, a clear message that the walls could not contain these men. The most famous escape, however, belonged to Ronald Buster Edwards. After over 3 years on the run, living in fear and exile, he made a decision that would cement his place in folklore. He simply walked away from an open prison. It was less a dramatic breakout and more a quiet disappearance, but it captured the public's imagination. He was a phantom, a cheerful, Cockney charmer who had outwitted the entire British penal system, if only for a while. The pressure, however, proved too much. The life of a fugitive was a lonely purgatory. In 1966, he walked into a London police station and gave himself up. The romance of the outlaw had curdled into the weary reality of a wanted man. Then came the most audacious flight of all. In July 1965, a prison van was transporting 3 of the train robbers, including Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind himself, between courts. The vehicle was ambushed in a quiet London street. A car swerved in front of it, forcing it to stop. Men with coshes swarmed the vehicle, overpowered the guards, and freed the prisoners in a matter of seconds. It was a brazen, cinematic attack that showed the gang's network was still active. They were unbroken. For a few glorious, terrifying months, Reynolds was free again, but he was now the most wanted man in Britain. The high life he had dreamed of was impossible. He was a ghost, moving between safe houses, his fortune largely inaccessible, the weight of his notoriety a heavier chain than any prison cell. The manhunts for these escapees were international affairs, spanning from Canada to Mexico. The police, led by the relentlessly dedicated Tommy Butler, who seemed to take the escapes as a personal insult, pursued them with a quiet fury. One by one, they were run to ground. Wilson was captured in Canada, living under an assumed name. Reynolds was found in a small flat in Torquay, his money gone, living a life far removed from the jazz clubs and fine art he had coveted. The dream was over. The reality was a return to the cell, to the 30-year sentence, to the endless stretch of time. The great escapes were thrilling interludes, but for most, they were only a temporary reprieve from the long, cold winter of their punishment. The recaptured train robbers returned to a prison existence that was now even more severe. Their escapes had shattered the myth of impregnable British justice, and the system was determined there would be no repeat. They were scattered across the country's most secure prisons, their movements monitored with paranoid intensity. The world outside moved on. The swinging 60s gave way to the gritty 70s. The music changed, the fashions changed, but for men like Bruce Reynolds, Ronnie Biggs, and Charlie Wilson, time was a frozen lake. They were relics of a single, spectacular night, their lives defined by a 45-minute period that had earned them a lifetime of punishment. The money, for those who hadn't lost it or had it confiscated, was a phantom limb, a presence they could feel but never use. Yet, the legend of the robbery refused to die. In the public imagination, the robbers underwent a strange transformation. They were no longer just violent criminals. They were folk heroes, cheeky rebels who had tweaked the nose of the state establishment. This was partly fueled by the sheer scale of their ambition and the theatrical nature of their escapes. Ronnie Biggs, in particular, became the face of this myth. After his escape from Wandsworth Prison in 1965 using a rope ladder and a furniture van, he embarked on a life of exile that was itself a kind of performance. He fled to Australia, then to Brazil, and with every taunting postcard sent to Scotland Yard, every interview given to a fascinated press, he cemented his status as the jester of the criminal world. His life in Rio de Janeiro was a bizarre parody of the high life he had sought. The climate was tropical, the beer was cheap, but he was a prisoner of his own notoriety. He could not spend his share of the loot for fear of extradition. He lived on the proceeds of his fame, selling t-shirts and charging for interviews in his seafront bar. The smell of salt air and frying food was a world away from the musty odor of the leather-slayed farmhouse, but the cage was still there. He was a tourist attraction, a man defined by a single act, growing older in the sun while the detectives who hunted him grew older in the rain. The chase had become a global stalemate, a bizarre, decades-long game of cat and mouse where the mouse was openly mocking the cat. Back in Britain, the human cost continued to accrue. For the families of the robbers, the notoriety was a curse. Wives became widows of living men, raising children under the shadow of their father's infamy. They faced social ostracism, constant police scrutiny, and the endless, grinding worry of visits to high-security prisons. The dream of a happy retirement funded by the loot was a cruel joke. The money, if it still existed, was a source of fear and paranoia, not comfort. Buster Edwards, after serving his time, tried to step back into a normal life. He became a familiar figure selling flowers outside Waterloo Station, a cheerful, weathered face from a past everyone knew. But the ghosts were too loud. In 1994, he was found dead in a lock-up garage, an apparent suicide. The cheerful Cockney charmer had finally been defeated by the weight of his own legend. The police, too, were haunted. Tommy Butler, the lead investigator, never let the case go. He pursued the remaining fugitives with a monomaniacal focus that bordered on obsession. For him, it was a matter of principle, a stain on the reputation of the yard that had to be cleansed. He died without seeing all the robbers behind bars, his life's work ultimately incomplete. The Great Train Robbery was not a case that could be neatly filed away. It was a living, breathing entity that consumed the lives of everyone it touched, criminal and lawman alike. The official narrative of justice being served was a thin veneer over a much messier, more tragic reality of broken lives and unshakable obsessions. As the decades passed, the moral questions surrounding the robbery only grew more complex. Were they daring anti-heroes or brutal thugs? The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the murky middle. The violence against Jack Mills could not be romanticized, yet the sheer audacity of the plan and the bumbling, almost comedic errors that led to their capture, the fingerprints on the monopoly set the abandoned farmhouse, lent it a strange human quality. Historians and journalists continued to pick over the bones of the case, uncovering new theories. Was there a mysterious, unseen mastermind, a fourth man high in the establishment who had provided the crucial intelligence and then been protected? Were the staggering 30-year sentences less about the crime itself and more about the establishment reasserting its authority after such a humiliating blow? The official files, slowly released over the years, provided facts but no final answers. The robbery had become a Rorschach test. What you saw in it said more about your view of authority, class, and crime than about the event itself. The final acts were played out in the full, unforgiving glare of the modern media. Ronnie Biggs, aging, sick, and impoverished after a series of strokes, finally returned to Britain in 2001. He arrived on a private jet, a frail, old man in a baseball cap, unable to speak or walk, being pushed on a stretcher through a scrum of photographers. It was a far cry from the triumphant escapee. He was immediately re-imprisoned, a decision that sparked national debate. Was this justice or vengeance? Was the state punishing a sick, old man for a crime committed nearly 40 years earlier? Or was it finally closing the book on its most persistent fugitive? He was released on compassionate grounds 8 years later, a hollow, final victory for no one. Bruce Reynolds, the brilliant architect of the heist, died in 2013, having spent his later years writing his memoirs and reflecting on a life defined by a single, colossal mistake. The Great Train Robbers, once symbols of vibrant, dangerous life, were now dying, their story nearing its inevitable end. The tracks at Sears Crossing are quiet now. The signal box is long gone. But if you stand there on a still night, when the wind whispers through the overgrown hedgerows, you can almost feel the ghost of that moment. The vibration of the approaching train, the gloved red light, the smell of fear and oil and cold, damp earth. The Great Train Robbery was more than a theft. It was a cultural fracture, a moment that exposed the vulnerabilities of the post-war order and created a new, more cynical kind of criminal celebrity. The money was spent, lost, or buried. The men are nearly all gone. But the legend endures, a chilling reminder of an ambition so vast it shattered every life it touched. The final, unsettling truth of the crime of the century is not that they got away with it, but that in the end, nobody really did. The end.